All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our session. We are hoping to talk to you today about sort of tech transfer in the academic realm. And the kind of first key is if you've seen it in one institution, you've only seen it in one institution, because every institution's a little bit different. But hopefully we'll be able to talk to you a little bit about how it generally works. So currently, my name's Andra Blomkalns. I'm vice chair at UT Southwestern, and also the clinical liaison to the Office for Technology Development there. And that is basically if ever a clinical faculty member has an idea for a device or a software or something to that effect, I help them negotiate the maze that is our tech transfer office. And I'm delighted to introduce, why don't you introduce yourself, Jeremy?
So I'm Jeremy Ackerman. I'm at Emory. I also have an appointment at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where I actually work with engineers to help them design stuff for healthcare, and have taken a couple of things through kind of the academic environment and either gotten things out to industry or close. So this was sort of a natural collaboration to try to introduce people broadly to how this all works.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions in the middle, just interrupt us. Obviously, this is an intimate group, so we'll be able to cover any questions in the meantime. So I had to put two pictures of MacGyver here because I might have, it's age-appropriate audience depending on how old you are and which MacGyver you might actually know. There are two big MacGyvers, but they oftentimes use word as MacGyverism or something, and I'm sure you've all seen your colleagues or yourselves glue, stick, whatever, something, tongue depressors to clamp noses or do whatever the case may be, to just improvise. And I just think emergency medicine is so perfect for this kind of thing because we're naturally inventive. We have to deal with what we have, and we make do, and we figure things out, and that's our job. So I like to think that emergency medicine is a perfect field to be able to develop devices. And so the trick is, so you have an idea, and then what? What's very different from our basic science colleagues, where their job is to develop new technology and new ideas, our job is to see patients and learn and do research. And oftentimes those ideas come up at the very least convenient time periods, the time periods where you're super busy, right after rounds, during rounds, whatever the case may be, and then it's like, poof, what happens to that idea? So what we're hoping to talk to you about is how do you capture that and then move it forward?
All right, so usually when I do disclosure slides, I throw a whole bunch of things up there, mostly to key in that actually, if you want to be in this domain of doing stuff, you actually want to be getting conflicts of interest. But for the purpose of a meeting like this, since we're not making clinical recommendations, nothing like that, and actually nobody's actually paid me in the past 12 months, so actually none of us have any conflicts of interest, but this slide I think is important to sort of address, because if you are interested in this area, you should be prepared to start having a disclosure slide that you may need to mention things before you get up in an academic setting. That's sometimes not viewed very well, but if you're here and interested, you should view having conflicts of interest as a very good thing. And in addition to what we're talking about, you will need to learn how to negotiate the conflict of interest resolution processes with your institution and with organizations like this.
Yeah, so let's say you have an idea and you think, gosh, I might really want to talk to this rep of this device company or call the company. The first lesson is don't. Write down your idea, keep it to yourself, don't email it to anybody. And it's not necessarily to be exclusive or to hoard anything, it's just much easier if it's not out there already, and then you run into the problems of public disclosure and whatnot. If you have an idea and you want to talk to a company, you talk to your tech transfer office and they will negotiate a non-disclosure agreement with that company. It usually takes 2 to 3 days. I don't know how long it takes for you, but hopefully 2 to 3 days?
Highly variable.
Okay. Not really that long. It's not like submitting an IRB. It's something. And then there's a contractual arrangement that they can't take your idea and steal it. So these are just the brief objectives. These are the things that we've already sort of talked about. We want to talk about the process, kind of show you a bunch of emergency medicine pertinent ideas that have happened over the last few years, and then a little bit about kind of the risks and perils of going out on your own.
All right, so we're going to focus on medical devices for the purpose of this conversation. although it is entirely possible, given that in emergency medicine we do a little bit of everything, you may have some laboratory research where you might possibly come across a drug. There are other types of intellectual property inventions and things like that that would need to go through tech transfer offices, and commercialization will be similar. But we're going to focus on medical devices because in addition to all of the intellectual property, there's a definition of what one is, and in order to bring a device to the market, you have to learn a little bit about the FDA, and that's something that you have to know relatively early. So we've got a definition here about it being an instrument, an apparatus, implement, and until relatively recently, there were some interesting caveats. Software was not considered a device, but now we have classes of software that by itself, software is sometimes a device. Okay? And then we also run into other things. There's a quick clot material that I would have sworn would be a drug, right? I put a chemical on, it causes a biological change. That sounds like a drug. Well, it turns out that substance does not actually cause any changes in metabolism. It is not metabolized. It's not a drug, it's a device. Okay, which may not seem like a big deal until you try to figure out if this is something you can get to market, and very different rules apply.
Excellent. So these are just a couple examples. The makers of Reactor, I believe, are actually in the exhibit hall, if I'm not mistaken.
Last 2 years. I didn't see him this year.
Oh, you didn't see him?
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't been through there yet. Lots of technology coming out with iPhone stuff. And it makes a lot of sense, right? It's an incredibly important tool that most of us have in our pocket or otherwise smartphone. A good thing is check what's already out there, because there's a good possibility something like it's already been done. That's not to say squash your ideas or whatever, but that one first kind of lesson is make sure there's something not out there so that you don't waste a whole bunch of time and mental energy trying to make something that already exists. But there's been a lot of technology built around the smartphone. Dermabond is a perfect example of what Jeremy just said. It is a chemical, but it's a device because it doesn't actually change the body in any kind of way. It sits on there and eventually it peels off. So the people who basically, it is super glue. It's cyanoacrylate, and there's nothing special about it other than they change the viscosity and it's a little bit purple. But obviously that's an incredibly successful medical device. And the other one's just cute, just irrigation kind of thing.
So in terms of trends that we're seeing in device industry, and this is where primarily established companies and kind of the companies that are getting out there and getting large amounts of venture infusions, we're seeing a lot of movement towards wireless devices. Combination devices is kind of one of the big things. Let's take a couple of things that were already out there, put it together. Wearables obviously are becoming big. Home and personal health, and sort of my prime example, and this is a little personal because I've got my pocket pancreas right here, but this is the Medtronic's newest insulin pump that combines wireless, a sensor technology, closed-loop software, and insulin delivery. All of the technologies separately have been around for a long time, but the novel device is combining these all together in a single licensed device that can go out and be sold.
There's a big push for devices that help people give their medical care at home. So home infusion pumps, that you've probably seen these antibiotic bulbs that kind of squish the antibiotics in over time. Oh, yeah. That's exciting. Come on in. Yeah. So and we're very sensitive to that, right? Because a lot of times we're admitting people because something specific has to happen in the hospital. So open your brains to the concept that you can think of ways that people can actually take care of their stuff at home, whether that's wounds or injections or like Neulasta is another example where people don't have to go back and get an injection. It just happens to them 72 hours after their last chemo. So there's a big push to basically cut healthcare dollars inpatient so that people can live and get their medical care outpatient.
Which I think is a great intro into assessing clinical needs. Historically, a lot of us as clinicians have identified clinical needs from so-called pain points. I'm working, I don't have the device I need, so we MacGyver together something, we make it work, and a month later go, hey, I've done this a couple times, maybe we should have a device. Or maybe you have a unique approach to how to do a particular procedure that can in turn turn into a device. But one of the huge advantages that we have in emergency medicine is we have this sort of odd bird's eye view of all of healthcare. We see the complications of procedures, we see the patients who fail outpatient treatment, and that gives you a unique perspective to identify some of these opportunities. Can a health system be better off? I mean, how happy would everybody in your hospital be if you would get the heart failure patients to not have to come back to the hospital? Right? They're not getting paid. Health system's going to be better off. Is there something that we can do to reduce healthcare-associated infections and other complications? When you start looking for something you can actually have impact on, these sort of pain points, but also identifying, is there something we can change? Is there a target? Something that I can actually hit this endpoint and drive me towards the desired goal. In the drug world, is there a receptor that does what we want? And then I just need the chemical that hits that receptor. Devices, you want to take a similar sort of approach. Unfortunately, when you get into the world of commercialization, just because you like a device and all of your friends and all of us here in this room go, awesome device, you do run into some issues beyond whether your patient likes it of will anybody else actually pay for it? Does it derive benefit for a system, for an insurer, to the point where somebody else is going to pay to put this device that we love in our hands so that it actually can be used? So we've got a couple more. I like the schnozzle. For those of you who've been in the exhibit hall, Joe Schultz, who's actually the inventor of the schnozzle, was there with it. Unfortunately, he is headed out to the airport. But of the medical devices in the exhibit hall, there actually were several examples where we had clinician inventors who were actually standing out there by those tables. You might have had to chat them up a little bit to find out that they were the inventors. But things like this schnozzle, which is just a fancy nozzle to spray out and irrigate people's noses, came from a pain point from a pediatric emergency physician. Okay? And so it's a great example of kind of an everyday problem that it's not that he's going to make billions of dollars, but clearly there's enough of a market that he can keep on coming back to SAEM and is making enough money to buy a table and try to sell all of you on his product. So it's a great example of how an everyday problem can certainly be turned to a patented, licensed, FDA-approved device.
And there are a couple other. One of them is just a wound irrigator, and it's just basically that plastic thing that has a universal threads on it, so it will go on virtually any bottle. And then this other one's very similar, but it just has an extended piece for abscess irrigation. So that's the purpose of this, just to kind of give you ideas that it doesn't have to be a new CT scanner. Things can be very, very simple and what seems like obvious, but the medical community still needs it.
All right, so in talking about kind of our motivation, as you develop an idea, you do need to sort of think it through a little bit and start looking at not just how do I build the thing, but how do we get it further down this pathway of getting it to market into people's hands. And that's where things like really understanding what is the unmet need, what's the clinical problem. You know, increasingly we're looking at devices that we may not put in a clinician's hand. We may actually want to put it in a patient's hand. And we do need to think about, would a patient want to use it? Why would they want to use it? And we're starting to get into some really interesting things and thinking through these problems where sometimes we don't have to worry about whether insurers are going to pay for it. These metrics that we get imposed, right? They're not paying for congestive heart failure readmissions. These are all things where healthcare systems are going, perhaps if we had a device or some other technology or solution that helps address us meeting this metric, we would do better on our metric. We would get paid more by CMS and insurers, and therefore we don't need a reimbursement code. We just need the device and we will buy it. And if you think about some of the metrics we're being asked to conform to, the dollar amounts there are actually rather staggering. And so this is a developing opportunity in device development.
So intellectual property, and we're going to go over just a few terms like intellectual property, patents, and those sort of things. So intellectual property is basically anything created by your brain that is an idea, and it can be converted to a copyright, trademark, trade secret, or otherwise a patent. And there are legal processes that are all different for each of those, but they're not as daunting and ridiculous as you might seem just by, but they're all very different. Now, every institution has a tech transfer office. They might call it technology development, they might call it tech transfer, they might call it technology commercialization, but every academic place has their own office. And each of them have their own policies for handling different things. So the first step ever is just to figure out where your tech transfer office is and sort of how they work things. Most of the time, the first step is filling out some sort of disclosure form to them to say, hey, this is the idea. It doesn't have to be completely fixed. It doesn't have to be completely made. It just can be an idea and some drawings, and you give it to them, and then they can start the protection process as you move through and continue, whether you're going to move to prototype and commercialization or goodness knows even a company or something like that. But the first step is to look at that your tech transfer office. The second thing that I know everyone's thinking is, okay, revenue. What happens if this gets big, and how much money I'm going to get because my tech transfer office in my university says they own it? And it's true. They do. In most academic institutions, they own your invention if it's medically related. If you create something that's something with a violin, no, they're not. They don't own that. But if it's something that is medically oriented, they own it. That's not a bad thing, because universities have a bunch of resources and processes and attorneys on retainer to deal with these things that's virtually impossible to do on your own. I know several of my colleagues who have tried to go out and do things on their own and may be getting some traction in about 10 to 12 years. It takes a long time if you're going to single-handedly try to do it. So I actually think the university owning your thing is a great idea, and actually you can go very far within your own university. The second thing, everybody has different revenue sharing arrangements. So at UT Southwestern, 50% of revenue goes to the investigator or the inventor, which is actually really quite generous. 25% goes to the president or the provost, and 25% goes to the department of the inventor. But every institution has a completely different setup for this. So this is my tech transfer office. They do mostly pharmaceuticals, and actually just recently have kind of climbed on board with devices. So you may find the same with your institution, because I think medical devices coming from academic environments is a relatively infrequent and sort of new thing, but I think very happily a growing thing for all of us.
Alrighty, so the one thing I wanted to add is you do want to find the formal policies. It's often going to be the intellectual property policy that will often cover multiple portions of the types of intellectual property, so patents and trademarks and copyrights. Each of those, they're going to have different rules. And the other thing, we're trying to thread a needle in terms of being encouraging and enthusiastic and say, go out and invent stuff. But the reality is, even those of us who have been successful, I have a lot more failures than successes. Okay? I've submitted a lot of things, and I've had quite a few patents submitted that have not been granted, with some granted. If you go it out on your own and you invest a lot of time and money, there's a reasonable chance that nothing is going to happen. And even,
but because you came to this conference here and this thing, you're going to be jump-started. Just that much.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I have to do the encouraging part.
Yeah, and it's one of those, that's part of why you're in a university that says, hey, we kind of own stuff that comes out of your brain, but it also means that more of your ideas, I think they're going to be able to be pushed forward into potential patents and things like that than it is likely you would be able to do on your own. Okay? So there's always a little bit of a give and take. But let's drill down into specifically patents, because that's probably the most common form of intellectual property protection that is likely to come out of your efforts. So a patent is essentially an agreement between the inventor and the government, which is you as the inventor agree to tell everybody how it's done, and in return, the government offers you the ability to be the only person who can make use of it. All right? And that gets a little bit tricky. It doesn't mean that necessarily you can actually bring your idea forward. because you may have to use somebody else's idea that there's a whole separate patent. I think we get to that in a little bit, and we'll come back to it. It gives you this right to exclude other people more than you can do it. No, you can exclude other people from using your idea, but you do have to essentially publish what the secret sauce is. If you think you've got an idea that's so smart nobody else will figure it out, that's where trade secrets come in. Don't tell anybody what the secret ingredient is, and see if you can get out to market without having that protection. But most things that we think of, somebody else is going to figure out what the secret sauce is, right? And so having a patent is a great way to give some protection, give this ability to keep other people from using this idea for a period of time. Now, it is property. You can buy and sell and lease and other sorts of arrangements. There's this weird thing that the designated owner or owners of a patent can do everything the patent that any other owner is. So there is, if we had a patent together, it's not that it's owned 50-50. She can go and license it to whoever she wants and cut me out of the deal, and I can go and license it. This is another advantage that you have in the university side of things. The university steps in and goes, okay, I know there were 3 of you who thought this idea up. We are the owner, and we will give you some proceeds back. And it makes it much easier to deal with industry as a single owner of a patent rather than having to deal with multiple separate people.
Another thing that, the whole patent system, the purpose of it was never really to protect ideas necessarily. It's the U.S. government's ultimate scientific publication, because the purpose of it was actually to make sure information that could forward science and medicine was out there for people to read and look at. Now, they couldn't steal the idea, but if that helped generate something for them in the future. So it was basically created so that people wouldn't hoard their ideas and otherwise not disclose them. So this is the ultimate public disclosure.
And more universities in promotions processes are actually viewing patents in that light, that this is actually a fairly prestigious publication. It's not universal, but we're seeing more and more where that's one of the things, if you have patents, it's now looked on favorably rather than sort of being ignored in some of the promotions processes.
So a inventorship is very similar to a authorship of a paper. There are some very specific guidelines whether or not you created the idea, you moved the idea forward, you wrote up the idea, you created the prototype. There are very specific things, and you either are an inventor or you're not. It's not really what you're letting other people do or whether or not you're going to let your friend who sort of thought the idea on board too. There are very specific definitions. The people who put forth the patent actually determine that from a very legal perspective. I'm a big fan of more inclusion than less inclusion, so I feel like putting more people on there gives everybody the chance to forward their careers, and if we make a little money in the process, sure, that's great. But nonetheless, there are some formal definitions, and I would say very similar to publishing a manuscript.
Alrighty, so I think this slide, our intention here was to sort of look at this and think about what the intellectual property is. So the invention is a device that allows you to inject these small sponges into a wound so that it absorbs blood and you get hemostasis. So is that idea of a device to inject sponges into a wound patentable? Probably. But if I invent this, can I necessarily start a company and start making it? And the issue there is there may be patents around injection devices. There may be patents around the sponges and the kind of sponges. And so even though I've got a device that uses multiple eyes together and I have a patent, I may not have the freedom to operate. I may need to go to the person who invented the sponges and has the patent on sponges helping get hemostasis and say, hey, can I have permission to use your patent in my device, even though we invented completely independently of each other. So having this patent can get very complicated as to whether there is a way to actually bring your device to market, because your patent may have to use somebody else's idea, and you may need to negotiate to be able to use their ideas that are incorporated in your device.
And it's certainly not a dead-end street. Many patents refer to other patents, and it's a community, really, and some people are harder to negotiate with than others, but it's not a hard stop if you need a piece of technology to move your technology forward.
And patents expire.
Yes, yes, indeed, 20 years, sure. So this is the Rhino rocket. It really did come from the idea of a tampon, because at one time tampons were used for hemostasis, and then they just moved forward with the idea and surrounded it by hemostatic gauze, and then ultimately incorporated balloons. But rather than describe it in its original terms, it's something like inflatable nasal packing device with 2 flexible bags, oversized relative to nasal cavities. It's like ridiculous, but it's very specific. And patents are very specific, and then it goes on for 4 additional pages of exactly what these things are made of, what they're supposed to do, how big they are, and all those other things. So once again, relatively simple concept becomes a huge product. So FDA classification, so that's another one of those words that people think, oh, you'll never get it through the FDA. The FDA is actually fairly liberal with devices. Most devices, they put them in classes, and the classes 1, 2, and 3. And class 1 are the most simple. They're not invasive. They could be wound dressings. Most of those can just go right on through. They're exempt. It's like IRB exempt. Yep, they're like, you don't need to pursue anything else, and here's stamp that you can go ahead and market it. And the FDA doesn't approve the actual device. They're approving your ability to market that device, and you need FDA approval to market it. You don't need FDA approval to use it. You need FDA approval to sell it. The second one, which is sort of, I think, a bunch of emergency medicine categories, that there's already something like it out there. So in that situation, if there's something like it already out there, it may go through a 510K or sort of a short form, sort of a quick submission. You can sort of think of it as a, I don't know, expedited IRB. It's just very much similar to the IRB. And it might not take long at all. The estimated time to get those through is between 3 and 9 months, which is very similar to my IRB. And so that's not really that long. Now, if you have a combination product that's highly invasive and is something like a heart valve or something like that, that's certainly going to take a lot longer. But there is a process for that. The FDA's got a great part of their website that talks about all the things that were invented in these different classes over the past year. And it's sort of fun to look at. It's also fun to look at all the things that were recalled, too. But I don't know. Sorry, that's what I do for fun.
All right. So part of why we're introducing these concepts is where you want to be as an inventor is you would like somebody to be using your device. And whether you start a company yourself and try to bring it forward to market or find another company that says, hey, great idea, we'd like to buy that idea, the term you're looking for is commercialization. And usually particularly with a patent, what needs to happen is a license. That is, the university, which owns the intellectual property, has a legal contract that allows someone, including potentially you or your company, to use your idea. Okay? Most of the time, universities will work with existing companies. And part of this is a calculated risk. They've paid for a patent. They would like to see some of that money that they've already invested in getting that patent back. And in general, it's going to be lower risk to them if they can find an established company that will pay for the patent costs up front and provide a fairly high probability of generating revenue from the patent afterwards. Often these licenses actually need to go fairly high up within the university system. It is not just the vice president. It is often to the board of the university where they are finally going to be finalized. And again, how the proceeds get distributed is usually going to be specified in the policies and procedures. Often that's going to be in the intellectual property policy.
This is just another couple examples. The first one up there is iGel, and so that was the endotracheal tubes that had gel instead of air, essentially, to help seal a little bit better, and it's been very popular. These other ones are called Smarty Pants, and they're basically breeches with vibrating pads on the inside to help decrease the chance of getting decubitus ulcers. So it stimulates the skin in a manner that doesn't allow it to get squished and static. So just germinating ideas in your brain about different things that can take place.
All right, so we have a couple more of the things, and some of which you've seen. So we've got a video laryngoscope. I think Ambu bought the company that made that one, and they were displaying that particular one. And actually, the inventor of that device was here at that table. You know, many of you have used Easy I/O. Somebody had to think, hey, I don't want to take that I/O and jam with the twist, and I always break the needles. Let's just spin it a little bit faster and have a more clever way of holding onto the needle to get into place. We've talked about things using smartphones. Obviously, there's a ton of capabilities on those phones. If you put a little bit of extra software and a device to adapt the sensors that are already there, and we're seeing more and more of these otoscopes, ophthalmoscopes, and other things using the sensors on smart devices that, again, you've probably been in a room and gone, I wish I could easily take a picture of what I'm seeing, get something else, and that certainly gives you a great pathway towards what could be a device that you might be able to get out to market.
So just in light of patents, so this is an actual patent for a wound dressing with Manuka honey. And the key that I want to bring up here is you can't patent things that happen in nature. So you can't patent dirt or the bacteria, specific bacteria in dirt. So, or consider the probiotics. They can't patent that bacteria. They can patent the delivery and the pill and that sort of thing, but they can't actually patent honey because honey already exists. But they can patent how that is packaged into a wound care dressing. So.
Alrighty. So for those of you who have heard about, hey, let your tech transfer office license things out, go back and see some patients, and you don't think that's the life for you, you want to get into a startup, this curve is something that you should see. It's the Valley of Death curve, right? And this is something that we know from medical startups, but also other types of technology startups. The issue here is with any sort of startup, there's this area where you need money, and you need more money at an accelerating rate, and you are not making that money. So that means you've got these little diamonds, which are places where typically you'll need an investor. And almost every company has this time, if it looks like a good idea and it's the right team, you get money and you get up to product launch. And for a lot of companies, it's even a little earlier, and you're out of money. Okay? And if you don't have a product launch and you're not selling things, there is no way to get onto that uptick. This is something in thinking about what's my product market, how are we getting there, you want, from a business standpoint, to be thinking about how do I bridge that gap of product development into commercialization, a product launch, and into sales, because, what's the figure, 90%?
Yeah.
90%, somewhere in that, from research downward, they run out of money and don't have a clear pathway for getting more money. And again, we kind of said this is a little bit of a pep rally, let's all do this, but you want to go in with your eyes open that there's some real risk there. And for those of you who don't have business experience, you want to get into this world a little bit and come to understand it, because if you do it yourself, you have to understand the business side, how the money that you might get operates, as well as if you're using your own money, understanding the risks that you're taking.
So this specific diagram is like the Krebs cycle of innovation and entrepreneurship. It comes up again and again and again and again. It's sort of the quintessential kind of formula for inventorship. So prototyping. So you have your idea. You disclose it to your Office for Technology Development. They meet and talk and say, you know, we think this has real promise. We've done a prior art search, which is basically a prior patent search, and we don't see anything else out there like this. We feel good about your clinical idea and what we think you should do. The next step is making a prototype. So prototypes can come in a variety of fashions. It can be stuff stuck together. It could be pipe cleaners. It could be, you know, essentially even drawings. It doesn't even actually completely have to work. If it works, that's even better, but it's more what does it look like. And most universities have some sort of funding to help you make prototypes. Many universities do not, and it's left to the investigator to do that. I've heard of people using their CME funds to do that sort of thing because it is a scholarly advancement. So finding the money to make prototypes sometimes is a little tricky, but they're not generally that expensive to make. If you're making something like we had a bronchoscope, a new novel bronchoscope that somebody was making out, you're going to have to hire some engineers, and that's going to be a contract, and that might be $10,000, $20,000 to make. But most things don't nearly cost that much. I want to say, so some institutions, particularly those with biomedical engineering departments or engineering departments, have these things called maker spaces, where they just have all the stuff you need to make things. And then they have a few dangerous things like saws and whatnot that they make you sign a waiver if you use them and cut off your fingers, you're not going to sue them. But they have a lot of stuff there so that you can actually use the tools to make things and even have people wandering around to help you if you run into any problems. So I just want to mention a few things. The number of times I've heard, well, we can 3D print it. Yes, the 3D printer is an amazing, beautiful thing. And yes, it is involved in many, many prototypes of medical devices. But it's not that easy to just plug in a few numbers and have a perfect thing pop out. It actually takes pretty sophisticated 3D printers, like not the kind that necessarily you can get on Amazon, but a really good 3D printer for a bioengineering program is approaching $1 million. But that's good because it actually makes things with some precision. And there's obviously a spectrum all the way in between. But most 3D printing projects end up looking like the one over there. It becomes just a tangled mess of filament, and it takes sometimes 12, 13, 14 hours to print, and you don't find this out until much later in the process.
Yeah. And in light of that, 3D printing, you need CAD models. There are a whole bunch of things that often the question you want to answer with your prototype, you can draw a picture, take a piece of cardboard. So as an example, I was working with some students on a non-contact way of measuring a baby's head circumference. We had an idea about how to do it, and the students, I said, why don't you rough it out, get some ideas of the dimensions, figure out whether we're going to 3D print this thing. And they brought me a prototype that the hand grip was a pistol grip. And I said, so let me get this straight here. I'm going to do this. No. All right. Mm-hmm. And as silly as that sounds, and it's one of those, as soon as you see it, it's obvious an awful lot of ideas that you have, very, very simple, rough prototypes, answer really important questions. Even the example of a bronchoscope. If we want a bronchoscope that we can put in an animal or people, we need $20,000. But can we get on Amazon a cheap borescope for 20 bucks and some pipe cleaners and some duct tape and kind of rough out the idea? A lot of times you can, and we're often hesitant to get something that doesn't look very good. But don't worry about the cosmetics. Your question is, can this solve the clinical problem? Is there something I didn't understand about this problem that by having a first step, we can get more information so when we spend the $20,000, $30,000, we don't take one look at it and throw it in the trash.
Right, and there are a number of commercial companies. Any reasonable sized city will have half a dozen 3D printing companies that print things for companies, other companies, engineering firms, and otherwise. And it's not as expensive as you think. I was working with some engineering students who needed specifically some stainless steel parts, and I thought that's just going to be cost prohibitive to print stainless steel parts. It was like a couple $100 and they got everything that they needed, and they didn't even have to put together the CAD program. They just walked into this company and got it. 3D printing, professional 3D printing outside of your university is really quite accessible and actually quite inexpensive.
Alrighty, so part of our point here is more to tell you about the process and not focus on all our fun stories, which I think both of us have fun stories. But I wanted to talk about one of the companies I've been involved with as an example of how this whole process worked. So the company is Interoptic. It is a company that came out of my PhD dissertation work and is sort of the classic example of an idea from academics licensed to a startup and continues on. So I was working on my dissertation that had to do with augmented reality and laparoscopic surgery. The picture on the middle, which is on the company's website today, is a minor modification of a picture that appeared in my dissertation in 2002. And basically I said, well, I'm done with my PhD, I'm going back to medical school, and one of the engineers I worked with on some of the core components said, I want to do this, this has been fun. And I said, go knock yourself out. He sold his Ferrari. He went back to the university and said, hey, we submitted a couple patents, I'd like to license it to this company I've founded. He got funding initially for the company through STTR and SBIR grants. Right, so those are the funding lines that are aimed at collaborations between small businesses and universities. And eventually, after going through 3 CEOs, several lines of VC funding, they have 5 devices on the market and make some of the back-end software in image-guided surgery. He's been able to buy a Ferrari, but nobody's getting super rich off of this, okay? This is one of those, he's got a small company, they're selling devices, but this is not millions upon millions of dollars. And again, this is 2002. The first year of profitability was 2012 for this company. But license, slowly bring it out, bring in outside money, and bring it forward.
So this is just a quick sort of diagram to tell you that in the real world, these things have a bunch of different steps, and it's from like who makes the plastic to how they put the plastic together to who's going to market whatever it is. And I'm going to plug that stick with your university. They can navigate this landscape a whole lot better than most people can. We're running up on time.
No,
all right,
that's
I gotta
fine.
Go. So sort of in summary, know what your individual university, what the rules are. Do a prelim search, and actually Google Patent is excellent at this. And there are some very fancy software packages and proprietary things, but Google Patent is actually really good. Talk to your tech transfer office. There's no problem at all with making an appointment and just talking over your idea. And if it's worth it, they'll move forward. And if it's not, then you know not to waste your time. Think about different prototyping options. It's not as hard as it looks, and it doesn't have to be perfect the first time. It just has to be something that somebody can look at and a story that you can tell with it. And just understand that funding can sometimes be a little tricky and sometimes fairly daunting, but certainly not impossible because gazillions of medical devices are patented and made every single day. So we really appreciate your attention. We're very passionate about this and both feel that emergency medicine is like in the perfect position to kind of move forward. And we're at the end of our time, but we'll hang out a little bit if anybody has any questions. And you're more than willing to I'm more than willing to have you contact me. I'll sign a non-disclosure agreement and just talk through whatever next steps might be, because sometimes it is a little tricky. So thank you very much for being here.
Do we have enough time for any questions?
I don't know. Do we have any time for questions, or are we done?
I think we're the last one in the room, so
we
may
that's
be able
good.
to just hang out if...
That's right. Excellent. Yes, sir.
So, one thing you didn't talk about was that patents are country specific.
Yes.
That is true.
And so if you're, you have to actually patent in the United States, but then if you want a device made in Japan, you have to patent in Japan. And so that makes work that's really expensive, all these international patents.
Yes.
Working with the university is probably paramount. And the other thing is, you need someone to defend your patent.
Mm-hmm.
Where you don't have, what happens to people try to change your patent or take a patent and make it. That's kind of why Elon Musk doesn't have any patents.
Right.
To steal this, it's all each other they kind of, because he says I'm not going to give the Chinese the blueprints.
Yeah.
Right, and it's, I think, particularly relevant. I think a lot of people associate patent equals success. You know, patent just means you disclosed it to the universe. If you actually want to protect your patent or defend your patent, that's going to be a whole lot of legal fees, like prohibitive amounts potentially of legal fees. To file a patent is really just a few $1,000s, 5, 7, 10, depending on how much your attorney charges you for different things. Anybody can actually just file a patent with the USPTO, but he's absolutely right. And one thing we didn't mention is disclosing things. In your institution, you can talk about your stuff in a seminar after you've talked to your Office for Technology Development. You can, present it at an internal poster presentation, but anything where the public is invited, that's considered a public disclosure and invalidates any international patents right off the bat. So I would say just make sure that it's okay to talk about it within your own institution, but don't bring it outside of that until there's actually some hard documentation.
Yeah, and it's a huge advantage of trying to work with the technology transfer offices and to a degree having the licenses. Many institutions, if you petition, you can actually get them to release intellectual property and they'll do a due diligence that they don't think it's worth enough to be worth their time. But that puts you in the position that if you want international protections, your costs to getting the patent issued go up by roughly an order of magnitude. and then that defending the patent afterwards. The university and tech transfer office has a stable of lawyers that part of what they do is they look for patent infringement and will go after that and try to defend that. And as a small business or an individual, that gets to be very challenging and expensive to do. It's not that it's impossible. There certainly are plenty of people who have done it, but as you're trying to also do other things, unless it becomes your main focus and you have sources of funding, this issue of maintaining the patents, protecting your own intellectual property really can be quickly pretty cost prohibitive.
Yes, sir.
Just to kind of piggyback on what you said, from the private side, so I actually did use practice in academics and then I got and went to fully private. And so if you were to go do it on your own and leave your university, you know, networks win in the game. It's good ideas are great, but networks will win and funding wins. And so university is like your best friend in some ways when you can come to terms on the technology deal. But that's going to be like your standard approval on your idea. When you go out on your own and you're in that valley of death, it's going to be you thought that out ahead of time, and then you know the investments you're going to go. You're going to know the negotiation terms. You're going to have a war chest of funds to fund your patent rules. And if you're thinking about using hardware, the hardware's part is generally the lingo because you need a ton of funds on your own. You need about $3 million in your seed to go out and actually have a chance of, you know, surviving past the patent. And if you're thinking, well, just build an app, you need at least $500,000 to build out your MVP. You might think you can do it for less than contract negotiation. So anyway, just like from that other perspective, is that, you know, it seems daunting to be like, the tech transfer office is going to steal my deal and my money, but you know, 50% of something is better than 100%.
Oh, that's good. I might use that.
Yeah, and there is a bit of a lifestyle decision. Do you want to be a medical technology entrepreneur, or are you happy seeing patients, working with residents? If you want to see the technology but you like your day job, and the technology transfer office hopefully helps you get there and still keep on doing what you're doing. But to really dive in to raise even $500,000, $3 million, and the more complicated devices getting to market, $100 million is often a starting point for a more complicated device. Starting point, that's not something you can do in your spare time if you're going to do it yourself. It takes a team, right? So if you get $100 million, you're going to need a whole bunch of other people. You're going to need to find venture capital, all these things. And in addition to the network, it's often about the team that you assemble around a product, sometimes even more than what the original idea was itself.